Okay, our guest today is Shannon Manning, and Shannon and I are old friends from too long ago. I won't say how long. Shannon, I won't read her bio because you have it and you can read it. What I'll say about Shannon, other than she's with a group called DDC Public Affairs, is that the reason I invite Shannon to come and the reason I find her interesting is that Shannon has a career track that I didn't even know existed, that you didn't even know existed. When she describes what she does, the first time I heard her describe it, I thought, I didn't know that that was a thing, and there's a lot of people that do what Shannon does, and it's a bit of a mystery. Like, you know how to get a job at the State Department or to be a Foreign Service officer. There's an exam for that, right? There's things, you've heard of lobbyists before, and there's a track to that you know of. You know how to work as an aide in Congress or in other things. What Shannon does, it isn't obvious how you get there. Nor is it obvious that this was even an opportunity that existed. And so it's worth paying attention to understand, one, the specifics about what she does, but also that there's probably other careers out there that you have no idea even exist that are open to you as opportunities. So I'd encourage you to use this as a way to think creatively, not just about maybe doing what Shannon does or something like what Shannon does, but also opening your mind to the possibility that you may not even know about the career opportunity that exists, that is out there for you. And when you find somebody that's doing something interesting that you've never heard before, it's worth engaging a little bit and finding out, how did you get there? What did you do? So without further ado, we'll hear from Shannon Manning.
Thank you, Quinn. I'll call him Quinn because we're old friends, Professor Monson. But it's a real pleasure to be here today. As the subtitle to my cover slide tells you, I did not start out as a poli-sci major. I graduated with a degree in English with a specialization in early American literature, pre-Revolutionary War to Civil War. I read a lot of sermons in college and loved it. But I would say that the thing that college taught me was how to learn and how to think. I didn't learn everything in college. I learned how to learn. And I think that's one of the most important things that this kind of environment gives you the opportunity to do, is develop your critical thinking skills and your ability to find yourself on a path and know how to navigate that path, even if it's not the path you expected, because my path was certainly not the path I expected. So how did I work in issue advocacy? Advocacy, you say advocacy, and most people think Greenpeace or the Sierra Club, social organizations that are engaging in advocacy, and that is absolutely a real thing. What people know about less is the emergence of advocacy as a tool for corporations, associations, nonprofits to influence the issues that are important to them, and to do it through stakeholder engagement. And I'm going to use a lot of terminology, and if I'm confusing you, just raise your hand and say, what do you mean by that? Because it's got there's a whole vocabulary associated with this that I live in every day, so I always kind of forget that not everybody speaks this language. So I had been out of college for a few years and was just not finding work in Utah doing what I wanted to do. And so I looked at my options, New York, LA, Chicago, Washington, DC, as places where somebody who wanted to write for a living was likely to find good opportunities, and picked Washington, DC because you may or may not know this, but the government is the largest publisher in the United States. And so moved to Washington, DC with no idea what I was gonna do, and just started looking for jobs and interviewing. And through a very long series of events that I won't bore you with right now, I got a job for a firm called Direct Impact, writing proposals. The company has since been 3 different companies, but the same people, and I have grown and evolved with the company over that time. to my current role, which is Senior Vice President of Communications and Engagement. And I spend all day, every day, helping clients think about how to talk to people outside Washington, D.C. about their issues. How do you make tax policy relevant to the average person? How do you make healthcare policy when it's not like we're in favor or opposed, but we're in favor this way versus this way. We want this kind of spin on the policy versus this kind of spin on the policy. Helping make very nuanced, very complex policy discussions accessible to the average person so that they will engage in the debate. And ultimately, that's what all of this is about, is getting the voters, whether it's you, me, the average person, whether it's a state elected official communicating with a federal elected official, whether it's the head of the Chamber of Commerce or the person who owns the small dry cleaner on the corner, engaging all those different voters in the policy process, because it is supposed to be a process that involves the voters. We're not supposed to send our elected representatives to Washington, D.C. and just hope they make good decisions. And so most of what I spend every day doing is helping clients think about how do you achieve that? How do you break through all the noise that surrounds people all day, every day, and get them to pay attention, not only to pay attention to your issue, but also to do something about it. And these are sort of just a smattering of the kinds of things that we do and that are part of this industry. Hill days, flying a bunch of people to Washington, D.C., or scheduling them to go up to the state capitol and meet with legislators. Turning out participants for hearings, rallies, fly-ins, staging press events, helping companies engage their employees in the public policy process. Town hall meetings, media relations is a big component of it. But it's media relations through a specific kind of lens, where it's not necessarily putting out a press release from the company, but getting the head of the Chamber of Commerce to author an op-ed that goes out to the press on the issue. Those kinds of things. So it's leveraging an array of voices and the right array of voices at the right times and in the right ways to influence the outcome of an issue. We are specifically, I was just telling my new friends here at the front, I tell everybody we are a law firm in the sense that we represent who we're hired to represent. And so I have worked, we will only work one side of the issue at a time, but we have been fired or parted ways with one side on the issue and gone to work for the other side of the issue. It happens all the time. It sounds very cynical, but it happens all the time in Washington, D.C. And so I have worked on both sides of different issues. I've also worked on just about every major issue that is relevant to the business world or the nonprofit world at one point or another. If it's a big issue on Capitol Hill, I've probably been writing strategies for how to engage voters in it, from energy to healthcare to transportation, high tech, pharmaceuticals, name it, literally, if you can think about it. Food bank funding is one that I worked on. There are more policy discussions going on out there than you think there are, and they matter to specific segments of the population, and we help clients engage those people. Any questions on that before I move on? Yes? What's a fly-in? Fly-in is a DC term for we're going to round up a bunch of people from out in the States and bring them to Washington, D.C., and take them into congressional offices and have them meet with the legislator. So it's a good example is when I was working on healthcare pre the Affordable Care Act, and we had a client in Florida that brought a bunch of seniors to Washington, D.C. to meet with their members of Congress on Medicare funding. And it's a lot harder for a member of Congress to brush you off when you're sitting in their office. So it's an expensive tactic, but it's very effective. Any other questions? Yes.
So you said that you will sometimes have to even switch sides on a specific issue. How difficult is it to, write and advocate for something that might go against your personal beliefs or thoughts?
That's a really good question, and one that a lot of people grapple with. And I especially grappled with it very early in my career because going to Washington, D.C. was a very eye-opening experience for an idealistic young English major from the West. Our political system is structured around the idea that you bring multiple viewpoints to the table, and through the process of compromise, and I know that's a dirty word for a lot of people right now, but through the process of bringing those viewpoints together and finding common ground, you arrive at the best solution for the most people. And in that sense, what I do is valuable regardless of which side I'm representing because I'm engaged, because I'm helping bring those viewpoints to the table and make sure they're adequately represented. It's also from a writer perspective, it's just a creative challenge. And I enjoy that. I enjoy having to think from a point of view that is not my own, and there's incredible value in that. If any of you have participated in debate, it's one of the fundamental principles of effective debate that if you can't effectively argue the other side's point of view, you can't effectively argue your own. And politics is a lot about arguing different points of view so that you can really see the whole picture when it's done well. I should say policymaking. Politics is a different thing. Any other questions on that? There's a half-raised hand there at the back.
So you said you're kind of like a law firm in what you do. How many of your peers are actually lawyers?
Very few of my peers in the company have law degrees. You find a lot of lawyers in government relations departments for companies. You find a lot of lawyers on the lobbying side of things. Advocacy, for whatever reason, attracts people who don't want to be on the legalistic side of things. Because we spend a lot of time figuring out, what can we say that's technically accurate, even if it's not, legalistically 100% there. Any other questions? All right. So these are the usual suspects as I like to call them, in my profession. On the left-hand side are the clients we tend to work with and the kinds of people who are typically involved in the campaigns and programs that we run. So corporate, association, and nonprofit, most of our clients fit into one of those categories. Professional organizations, like a labor union would qualify as a professional organization. Different from a trade association in the sense that it is representing individual people versus lots of companies, lots of different companies. 501Cs, everything from 501c3, C4, and C6, which probably doesn't mean a whole lot to you, but it's basically a government classification that determines how you operate and what you can spend your money on in the political space. And so a 501c3 is a traditional nonprofit. They cannot spend money on advocacy. On political candidate advocacy. They can advocate on issues. A 501c4 and a 501c6 are organizations that are established for specifically political purposes, and they can spend money on things that 501c3s can't, which is much more in the weeds than you wanted, but it's helpful to know because there are different paths of opportunity in each of those categories if you are thinking about getting involved in issue advocacy. NGOs, lobbyists, we do not, my firm does not engage in direct lobbying personally. I am not a registered lobbyist, but we work with lobbyists all the time in terms of campaign strategy and understanding what is going on Capitol Hill that we need to know about to make sure the grassroots campaign or the grass tops campaign is channeling the right messages to Capitol Hill. Within individual companies and trade associations, you have policy specialists. We work with communications departments. We work with external affairs, which is not policy focused, but is engaging with the rest of sort of the, engage with public perception and with other organizations that might be affected by what happens within the company, something like that. Legal, we talked about, and then think tanks, my favorite Washington, D.C. trend. So there's a lot of different players in this space that can all come into play one way or another when you're talking about an advocacy campaign. On the right-hand side are the audiences that our campaigns typically target. So we target legislators and regulators. That's kind of obvious. They're the ones most directly making the policy decisions. We work a lot with governors' administrations. We don't do a lot of work directly with the presidential administration, but we do a lot of work at the state level with governors and their departments. Influencers. This is a very broad term that means a lot of different things, but it basically means someone who, because of their sphere, their reach, where they stand on an issue, will guide where their community lands on an issue, whether that community is a literal geographic community or an online community or any number of, however you want to define communities. There was about a year ago, there was a really good article that came out called the Pta Effect on Twitter that talked about the fact that in policy debates and politics, what you really see is happening at the national level is what happens at the local level in something like a PTA, where there are really 2 or 3 people. You may have a PTA with 30 members, but there are really 2 or 3 people who determine the outcome of discussions and debates. And so that's what we mean when we talk about influencers. And how do you find the influencers and engage with them so that they will bring more people along with them? And then obviously, just the general voter population. And slicing and dicing that a lot of different ways. Any questions on this? All right. So here is the evolution of the industry timeline. Corporate and association advocacy programs really started to become a thing in the mid-'80s, which most of you don't have any memory of, but where corporations and associations and nonprofits really started to notice the influence of true grassroots organizations like Greenpeace, and started to see the value in engaging with people and bringing them in on their issues. In the 90s, the advocacy profession as a profession and as a sort of a specific niche within public affairs really started to take hold. And it took the form of what we refer to as ad hoc campaigns, where a client would be facing a specific legislative or regulatory issue. There was a specific piece of legislation that they wanted to influence the outcome on. And so we would help them stand up a campaign. We'd, at that point in time, do mostly a lot of direct mail and phone calls because email was not universal. And mobilize a whole bunch of people to communicate with their policymakers. The issue would be decided, the campaign would come down. The rise of electronic communications in the 90s really made advocacy much more impactful and much more cost-effective, frankly, than it was previously, and so more and more organizations started to engage in it, and hence firms like mine started to grow and grow, and there became more of us. So we get to the 2000s, and you see the emergence of things that make advocacy more effective than it's ever been in terms of big data and micro-targeting. The George W. Bush administration was the first sort of poster child story of the use of micro-targeting and data for political campaigns, especially where they identified a subset of Hispanic women in Arizona that were Democrats, but had huge concerns about education. And they were able to win those votes by targeting direct mail and phone calls and email at those women, at the women in that audience, specific to the education issue, in a way that very few campaigns had ever been able to do before. And it was game-changing for the industry, for politics in general. The other thing that started to happen in the 2000s was the rise of transparency. And so prior to this, corporations would run advocacy campaigns, but it would be kind of like, we don't admit we're doing this. It's happening over there. And our biggest goal in life as the consultant was to make sure our clients' names never appeared in the press related to the programs we were running. That started to change in the 2000s, where it became more, we started to see the value in these corporations and associations embracing their role in supporting these programs. And now everybody knows that the American Petroleum Institute sponsors the Energy Citizens Campaign, or everybody knows that the American Public Transportation Association is responsible for Voices for Public Transit, or other campaigns that we run. And this is important to the evolution because it starts to move us out of that put a campaign it, run it, take it down mode, and into a space where we now run programs for clients for years and years and years. Sustained programs, they're continually educating, they're continually engaging, they're continually mobilizing. 2010s, social media happens, and we are still figuring out what social media means for policymaking and politics. But it really allowed digital engagement and digital targeting really have allowed advocacy to become a surgical thing, a much more surgical thing and a much more sustainable thing over the long term, which is kind of where we are now. At the same time, we're seeing the really dramatic increase in political polarization and echo chambers that grow much more organically and are harder to break through because of social media in many respects, and the way social media platforms set up their algorithms to feed you content that they know you're interested in, so you only see messages that align with your points of view. That impact of social media on our public discourse has been like somebody setting a bomb off, honestly, in our profession, because getting through those echo chambers and getting to really engage people the way that we need to is harder than it's ever been before. So what does the future hold? The importance of influencers is this is me prognosticating, so don't hold me to any of this if I'm wrong 5 years from now. But I think the importance of influencers is only going to continue to grow, as is the importance of non-traditional alliances. And what I mean by that is, for example, we have been working with a defense contractor on leveraging the entertainment sector to help convey support for what they're trying to do as a defense contractor, which sounds completely counterintuitive until you think about the impact that movies like Transformers, the role that an F-22 plays in that movie. It's a huge part of the movie, and there is this weird alignment between the entertainment industry and the defense industry that becomes important when you're talking in the policy space. Also the blending of brand advocacy and issue advocacy. The other thing that we're seeing much, much more of is, because of the rise of social media, because of the way the communications culture has changed in the last 10 years, the separation between a corporate brand and its business and its participation and involvement in the policy process and what that means for the company is more and more becoming conflated so that you can't do one without doing the other. And so there are new opportunities even now emerging in advocacy that weren't there 5 or 10 years ago in terms of roles for advocacy specialists within companies, brand marketing, brand champions, brand advocates that create value on the policy side. Any questions on that? All right, either you're bored to tears. Yes.
How do you try and break through the echo chambers?
Oh, that's a good question. There is no silver bullet, is the problem on that front. We leverage a wide array of tactics and strategies to try to break through. Part of it is digital targeting. It's getting really, really precise, and even just in the last few months, there are technologies emerging that will allow us to target a message at you based on where your phone is at any given time of the day. We can follow you around. Not only can we follow you around, we can follow the head of the Department of Transportation around and her staff and target messages at them, as well as at the voters that are most important to her. So that's a part of the component. That's part of it. Part of it is making issue education more compelling, leveraging video, leveraging non-traditional channels, like putting information in front of someone, not because they're reading The Hill or Politico or the Washington Post, but because they're reading an article in Home and Garden that we know their interest in that also indicates an interest in our issue. Those are just a couple of examples using unconventional tactics. So if we know that you are saturated with digital communication, we might try to hit you with non-digital communication. But there are a lot of different ways we try to work through that. Other questions? Yes.
So do you use people who have experience with machine learning?
Yep. There's a whole branch of our industry, not just advocacy, but public relations and public affairs in general, that right now is dedicated to AI in this space and the role of AI in this space.
What that is,
Oh, artificial intelligence, sorry, machine learning. Yes.
Do you think then that as we bring in more artificial intelligence and machine learning, that parts of the general profession will become obsolete? Is there like a time?
I don't think there's a time frame for that, and I don't think it will become obsolete anytime in your or my lifetime, simply because you still have to be able to deal with the complexity of a human being. And where a person stands on an issue is not necessarily reflective of what matters to them in other parts of their life and where they spend their time. And you have to be able to look at the data and parse what it means in a very nuanced way that I don't think artificial intelligence has yet gotten to.
What are some of the most important or valuable pieces of information that you can gather from someone in determining how they'll vote on an issue?
Oh, you can look at obviously political affiliation is a big indicator, but we also look at what media do they consume, what TV shows do they watch, what organizations, if they volunteer, where do they volunteer and how do they volunteer? In their online conversation, what do they talk about that tells you what's important to them? So, and this is just one example. If you're talking about an issue to this is grossly overgeneralized. But if you're talking about an issue to someone of, like someone who's conservative leaning and of Slavic descent, they are going to value authority and structure and things like that in ways that, if you're talking about the same issue to someone who is Hispanic, they're going to be much more concerned about family and culture and tradition. And again, this is gross overgeneralization for purposes of illustration. But those are things that you learn not by their political affiliation, but by looking at what do they talk about online? What TV do they watch? Where do they spend their free time? Those are all important indicators of what is really going to motivate someone on an issue that has nothing to do with the issue itself. Hand in the back.
Have you guys ever gotten in trouble, like with privacy laws or regulations, or is that kind of like a gray area right now?
We have not gotten in trouble with privacy laws because we pursue what we call an opt-in approach, where we will present you with a message, and if you engage with us, then we target you and we try to get you to engage with us further. Other people in the profession have gotten in trouble for playing fast and loose with privacy laws, and privacy laws make things complicated. What we could do with Facebook 5 years ago, we can't do anymore because of new privacy laws.
A more general question about what you're doing related to your background. So I find it fascinating, Shannon, you're talking so much about data. And what I know about you is that you don't have any training with data.
Nope.
So talk to us about what, if you knew what you know now, about what you'd be doing, what kind of training might you have gotten, or are you fine with what you have?
I mean, I am fine because we have people who do the data part. And you know this because you and I have done some stuff together. We have people who provide us with the data, and I read the data and go, okay, this is what the data means for communication. If I were to go back, I would probably take a couple of classes in data. I'd probably take a statistics class, which I avoided like the plague when I was in college. Ironically, one of the classes I didn't want to take in college was economics, and that class has proved enormously valuable in my profession in ways that I would never have seen when I was a student. And so I think if you are planning to be involved in politics and public policy, you need to think about all these things. Like, you need to think about communications, because most of politics and public policy is a communication exercise of one kind or another. And how do you communicate effectively, and how do you communicate persuasively? How do you parse an argument? How do you parse an audience? Those kinds of things. Any other questions? Yes.
So you said that economics was coming really in handy in your field, which, if I remember correctly, is like issue advocacy, public affairs, that sort of thing. So how does an economics class really help with that?
Economics taught me how to understand supply and demand, and how those things, how that, like, it's not necessarily that I'm literally using economic policy, but economics taught me things about how the world works that I would not have understood otherwise. And understanding those things has made me much more effective at building an argument around a specific issue, because I understand what factors into the balance between demand for something and supply of something. That's just one example, but it's definitely played into my profession in ways that I would not have expected. Anything else? Okay. So this is where, to tee this up, one of the questions that they suggested I think about is what advice would you give people thinking about a career in this field? And because this is BYU, I'm going to talk about this in ways that only people at BYU would understand. But I also recognize that not everyone here may be a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, so I'm going to talk about it through that lens, but I think it's relevant regardless of your faith background. We live in the era of false choices, and advocacy in that space is challenging. It's not just professionally challenging, it's personally challenging. False choice, and here's what, let me get to. So, there was a very brief period of time when I was in high school where I was thinking about being an architect. And so I took drafting classes. And in drafting and design, there is this thing called the central design feature. And it is that thing around which the entire structure is built, is designed and built. It is the focal point, it is the design principle that brings the entire thing together. So this is a pretty typical picture of a house that is common in Utah right now. This kind of style of home building is pretty common in Utah right now. What would you say is the central design feature of this house? Yeah? The garage, yes. The place where you park your car, your boat, and your truck. This is not an accident. This is very carefully thought out design. And it appeals to people because for whatever reason, having a big garage says something about you that matters to you. And I'm not being critical of people who live in houses like this. I'm just telling you, like, designers put a lot of thought into this. This is not accidental. So what is the central design feature of a democratic system of government? I'm going to give you the answer. Compromise. Democratic government hinges on the ability of people of differing points of view to compromise. And when we lose that ability, we lose our ability to govern effectively. This is where I'm going to pontificate for a minute, so stay with me. The problem is that we are living in an era in which compromise is considered evil or wrong or weak, and where there is such unwillingness to compromise, to accept a good idea because it comes from the opposing party, to say, I can't have everything that I want in this policy, but if I get this much of what I want and you get this much of what you want, we end up in a good place for everybody. That is what the whole system is aimed at, and we are losing that ability. And that puts us at risk, not just in terms of policymaking, but if you look at it historically, when democratic societies start to become as polarized as ours is becoming is when they become vulnerable to the rise of totalitarianism, for a lot of reasons. I'm, again, oversimplifying dramatically. But I want you to think about this because if you are considering a career in politics and public policy, this is the environment you are walking into. And understanding that environment is important because you can do something about it. So this is what I mean by false choices, and you probably can't read this well because of the design, but do any of these things sound familiar to you? Pro-Republican equals anti-Democrat and vice versa. Any vote that isn't cast for one of the two major political parties is a wasted vote. You cannot support fiscal responsibility and social programs at the same time. Anyone who is pro-life is anti-woman, or conversely, anyone who advocates for women's equality, workforce equality, is anti-family. Pro-environment equals anti-business and vice versa. And I would say we could probably sit here for another hour and just keep adding to this list. But this is what I mean by false choices. Our current rhetoric and our current approach to politics and governance, well, for one thing, politics and policymaking are not supposed to be the same thing, but in our current space, they are becoming the same thing, and that is inherently dangerous because you say things in politicking that should not carry through when you are negotiating policy. It's also inherently dangerous because it puts us in a place where we think that we can take something that is very complex and very complicated and that is making policy for what will soon be 400 million people and reduce it to black and white choices. And they are false choices because they are not, you don't really have to make these choices. You don't have to drink the Kool-Aid. You don't have to say, if I am a conservative, I am 100% on the party platform in order to be a conservative. And there's a whole, we could spend a lot of time going into the history of the last 25 years and how we got to where we are right now. But it really comes down to this idea that ideological purity is more important than compromise. And it started in the Republican Party. It's happening now in the Democratic Party. It's not, and not only is it happening in the United States, it's happening throughout most of the Western world right now. And the reason I bring this up is that I can stand up here and I can tell you, be good at networking. Be good, you know, make sure your resume doesn't have any typos in it. You know, I can give you that advice, and it's good advice. But much more powerful advice that I can give you and that I feel is important to give you, especially in this profession, in this part of our society, is that politics and public policy has never needed more, not never. I would say we needed it in the Civil War pretty badly, but in our lifetime, it has never needed more than it needs now, people who bring these things to the profession. And integrity, compassion, humility, confidence, and accountability. These things are the things actually that will make you the most valuable employees, the most valuable professionals. They're not just the things that make you a good person. And I am where I am and have had the career path that I've had in part because I'm not patting myself on the back, but in part because my bosses know they can trust me. And I am not always trying to be the loudest voice in the room. And I listen to other people. And I come into things with an open mind. And I have the ability to look at the other person's point of view and say, there are valid reasons why they feel that way or why they believe what they believe. And because I acknowledge the validity of that point of view, I can find common ground with them. And all of those skills, these are skills, like these aren't just attributes, these are skills that you can actively cultivate in yourself. And they will make you better at politics than almost anything else you can do. And it seems counterintuitive, but I can tell you as someone who has over the last 20 years hired many, many people and trained them and mentored them, that the employees, regardless of their faith background, regardless of anything, but the employees who bring this into the company are by far the most valuable employees we find. Because they're also the employees that I know I can ask them to do something and know that they'll do it. I don't have to follow them around and make sure it gets done. And that is a huge benefit for me as an employer. Somebody asked earlier, I think it was you, but if it wasn't, somebody asked, how do I deal with advocating on a point of view that is not my own or that might conflict with my personal beliefs? So I'm going to share a little story with you. So at our last state conference, Elder Jack Gerard was assigned to speak, and he was called to be a general authority at the October 2018 General Conference. I knew him as Mr. Jack Gerard, the CEO and president of one of our major clients, for years before he was called to be a general authority. So after the conference ended, I went up to say hello to him, and it was a time when I was particularly struggling with what is happening in politics and public policy and how toxic the environment has become in many ways and how challenging it is to navigate. And is this really a place where a profession where I want to be? And is it harming me as a soul in some way? And he said, he jokingly said, I feel like I'm being given, now that I'm been called to be a general authority, I feel like I'm being given the chance to make up for all that I did in Washington, D.C. And we laughed a little bit. And I said, well, I struggle with that myself. And he said, everything that you are doing and learning and practicing is part of preparing you for what the Lord wants you to do. And he said, I would never have guessed when I embarked in public policy years and years and years ago, that as a general authority, I would need all of those skills. And I'm never going to be where he is in the church, but I take great comfort in that, and I take comfort in it even independent of the church and the faith, because it is an important thing to remember and to keep perspective on, that everything you do can contribute good things, even if you are in the middle of an environment that is not as positive. Which is why I would leave you with these three things may seem unrelated, but what you can bring to the future of government and advocacy, if you decide to pursue this profession, take the school motto seriously. Enter to learn, go forth to serve. If you keep the second part of that always in the forefront, no matter what you do, you will be doing good in the world. The second is a quote from Elder Holland at the Maxwell lecture he gave last November. He said a lot of amazing things, but one of them was, seize the opportunity to act more and be acted upon less. So when I talk about bringing integrity and compassion and humility and accountability to your profession, that's what I'm talking about. Be someone who knows who you are and stay true to that, regardless of what's going on around you, and you will be a force for good in politics and public policy. And then the last is, if you have a chance, if you haven't seen it and you have a chance, I would encourage you to find a recording of the BYU devotional Gayla Sorensen from the law school gave 2 years ago, called To Me He Doth Not Stink, Advocacy and Love. And she talks about the fact that advocate is one of the titles that the Savior carries, and that we are here to be advocates for each other, for ourselves and for each other, and that there is good in advocacy, and how you advocate and what you advocate for making the world. And that's why I think I have stayed in my profession as long as I have, and why I feel very blessed to be part of this profession, even though it's not what I set out to do when I was a college student, and it's certainly not where, it's taken me places I never would have imagined. It has been one of the greatest blessings in my life. So with that, thank you all for having me today, and any other questions you have, I'm...
Why don't we finish and then bring those questions up one-on-one?
Perfect.